Good evening, everyone. I'm Ugo Trambali, Senior Advisor with ISPI, the Italian Institute for International Studies, and columnist with Il Sole 24 Ore, which is the Italian equivalent of Financial Times. The food climate nexus, the quest for food security in the North Africa and Middle East is our topic tonight. This meeting today is one of the ISPI's initiatives we are organizing together with the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs after the Med Dialogue Summit we got last December, and before the next one in December this year, with first, second, and third of next December. Of course, we will this year. Our conference will be free, full, and happy presence, inshallah. MENA is one of the most food and secure regions, sadly, not just for food security. According to FAO, 69 million people out of 411 million were undernourished in 2020. That means 5 million people more than the previous year. CCC, conflict, climate, COVID. It's the name of the perfect storm in the Middle East. The priority of the emergencies is interchangeable. In some places, in some country, conflict is first. Elsewhere is climate or pandemic. But today we'll focus on climate and COVID only, which are more than enough. We'll discuss on conflicts and food security in another meeting soon. A growing population and low productivity are just two of the structural challenges in the region is facing. Dependent on food import, MENA is suffering from the disruption of the supply chain caused by the pandemic, plus climate change with a devastating consequence. It's an essential threat to any strategy whatsoever. So, what measures should be taken to make the region more secure? What steps are needed to get more productivity and technologies? What is the role of the international institutions? Well, we'll try to find an answer to these compelling issues tonight with Dina Saleh, the Regional Director of IFAD, the United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development in Rome, with Nadim Farajalla, Director of Climate Change and Environment Program at IUB, the American University in Beirut, and by Eckhard Furz, Middle East Director of the German Institute of Global and Area Studies, GIGA, in Hamburg. So, Dina, let me be straight. Let's start immediately straight. Climate and COVID, the state of food security in the Middle East today. A picture. Fadda, please.
Thank you, Ugo. Thank you, and pleasure to be with you all today in this very interesting dialogue. So, as you already set out the stage, the MENA region is an area with sensitive, intricate, and interrelated challenges, and but also opportunities. So let me just also try to give a bit of a context here. You know, despite hosting only 6% of the world's population, it represents almost 20% of the world's people at high risk of food insecurity. Therefore, food security remains a high priority in the MENA region. And there are several factors, as you also outlined some of them, you know, the high population growth. So obviously what we're seeing here is an increasing growth of 2% per year, with the second highest rate in the world. And therefore the carrying capacity, you know, there is an imbalance between the carrying capacity of the environment with the growth rate of the population. Another factor to put in place here is the water scarcity. This is the world's most water scarce region globally. It receives annual average water availability per capita of about 1,200 cubic meters, of which the world's average is about 7,000 cubic meters. So it just shows you the kind of challenges that, in addition to what you already said, the perfect 3 Cs that is heavy for any region to deal with. Of course, it's also a region that is heavily reliant on food imports. And then, of course, compounded by conflict, which is, we all know that about this region. So food security is a severe concern for the MENA region before the pandemic. But then with the combined impact of COVID and climate change has just exacerbated the existing challenges to food security. And just to go back to the factors that I outlined at the very beginning, was about climate change will negatively influence the water scarcity, with rainfall projected to decline by 20 to 40%, with 2 degrees hotter scenarios, and up to 60% with 4 degrees increases in temperature. And this is obviously going to have an impact on water availability, and more, of course, torrential precipitation, which is rainfall, is going to be erratic. And we expect, of course, this to have a huge impact on rainfall. And we all know this region is heavily dependent on rain-fed agriculture. So if you just look at it, you talked of perfect storm. I think this is much more hurricane or a typhoon hitting the region. And therefore, it does, require a lot of attention. And we also need to put into place the effects of the pandemic, which will have much longer impact beyond what we see today in terms of, impacting the supply chain, as you also outlined earlier, the food demand. And of course, with border closures that occurred, we have seen what that has done in terms of, impact on the rural space and on labor and on small and medium enterprises. So this is overall, in a nutshell, to tell you, yes, you did ask, what is the state of food security? There is a problem. And I think, we have a lot on our plate right now to deal with. Back to you, Hugo.
Thank you. Well, so that's the first step. Nadim, which countries are the most affected by the issues that Dina just mentioned?
Thanks, Hugo. Thank you for hosting this nice dialogue. It's imperative that we keep talking about this issue. Hopefully somebody would listen and do something about it properly. Who is most at risk? Look, there are different aspects of looking at this. If we look at the economic capabilities of the countries in the region, those that have the highest GDP tend to make do with it, with adapting to whatever is happening. OPEC countries tend to have high GDP. They can reach out and plug whatever gaps they're getting in terms of their food security. They can supplement or augment their water resources capabilities in terms of desalination by more desalination plants. But that then eats away into their ability to export more oil, to bring in more money, to spend on these things. So OPEC countries, in terms of their vulnerability, are the lesser vulnerable. They're not invulnerable, they're very vulnerable, but less. I will jump to the most vulnerable now, and these are what we can, nicely say, the fragile states. Those countries that are experiencing conflict, those countries that are experiencing internal upheavals, those countries that have economic issues, severe economic issues, their adaptive capacity to whatever is going to happen is very, very, very limited. Yemen, Somalia, Libya, then moving into Syria, Sudan, Lebanon, Iraq, they are all quite vulnerable to whatever climate changes that Dina had mentioned. Increase in temperature, decrease in precipitation, increase in demand on water, etc. Now, and then there are them in between countries, those that are sort of steady, but they need some support. Egypt, Jordan, the Maghreb, Morocco, Algeria, they are Tunisia, they are fairly well established. They're not fragile per se, but they can be considered with lower adaptive capacity. Now that's on the ability to counter what's going to happen. The Mediterranean Rim parts of the Arab world and the MENA region are going to suffer most. In addition to temperature rise, what is going to happen is we're going to experience some sea level rise, which is going to inundate great parts of the coastal regions. And coupled with that, whatever storm surges are going to come in, which is going to be quite destructive to infrastructure along the coast and to coastal habitats, whether on the coast or marine habitats. The same applies equally to the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf areas. These low-lying parts of the MENA region are going to suffer quite a bit in that. So it's not one country. Every country is going to be experiencing some level of distress resulting from this. Then you can then go into what sectors are going to be impacted mostly. And then you can go through the same analysis. The water sector is going definitely to be top of the list. Less water coming in, longer droughts, longer heat waves, more dust storms, more forest fires, wherever forests exist. And we've seen this in the past summer. The Mediterranean Rim countries really suffered severely from forest fires all around, Northern Europe, Northern Mediterranean, Southern Mediterranean. I'm just focusing on this part of the world, Eastern Mediterranean. All of these suffered, and the livelihoods of people associated with forests and whatever the ecosystems in forests provide in services, they also suffered. So there is this chain effect, the cascading effect of this is going to, the knock-on, going to transcend just one country. It's going to affect all others. And then this would lead to people moving from one part of the Arab world to others. You said that 3 Cs conflict is driving people away from their homes. Impacts of climate change are going to drive people from their homes. This will lead to more conflict, or at least more tension, which would then aggravate the situation. If you pile onto that COVID, you've got the perfect storm in that. So it's not one country. The whole region is going to be negatively impacted. The degree of negativity will vary a little bit with whatever adaptive capacity these countries have.
Sure.
Thank you.
Just a follow-up. You just mentioned that the most affected region by climate change. By the way, I mean, Levant and the Crescents are the most affected also by conflicts. I don't know if there is something to do, but it's thank you, Nadim. Eckhard, similarities and differences between countries in the region in this context, please.
Well, all of them are grain importers or food importers, and not only of grain, but also, for example, of poultry or of dairy. The big difference is kind of how they can handle this vulnerability, whether they can afford food easily, as Nadim has just pointed out. So some are in a much better position than others. And another difference is also in terms of demography, right? Like contrary to some images that the Middle East has this runaway population growth, actually large parts of it are well ahead in a demographic transition. In countries like Iran, like Lebanon, like Tunisia, and so on, we have birth rates at or below the replacement level. In other countries, you still have higher birth rates, Iraq, Yemen, also Egypt recently. So, and even once you are at a replacement level, population growth will, of course, still continue. But if we kind of look forward 30, 40, 50 years from now, actually we see rather aging societies in some parts of the Middle East. So there is also one difference. Another difference is that quite a few countries are food importers for staple foods, but are also exporters for other food items, fruit and vegetables. Turkey belongs to the top 10 agricultural export economies in the world. Morocco is among the top 5 exporters of strawberries. Tunisia has developed into an exporter of olive oil. So that also needs to be taken into consideration. Of course, that affects also the availability of water. You could then question, is that a good idea to use that water for export? Or might it make sense that this is a specialization along comparative advantages? So some of these farmers now have money to buy imported grains, but clearly there are a lot of differences. And when we talk about food security in the region, actually, agriculture is important, but much more we really would need to think about what happens to drought elsewhere in the exporter nations, right? In a way, drought in Russia or in Australia or North America is as, if not more crucial for future food availability in the region than drought in the MENA region itself. And then secondly, do they get the foreign exchange to pay for these imports if these imports will be available in the future? And there we are talking about the long-run sustainability of the economies after oil. And there are, of course, again, huge imbalances. And the third point, I think, that deserves to be pointed out, when we talk about food security, there is no shortage of calories in the region, right? Some of the countries in the region have the highest obesity rates in the world, not only in the Gulf region, by the way, also a relatively poor country like Egypt. So it's rather that people, for one reason or another, take recourse to very calorie-rich foods, ranging from subsidized bread in Egypt to soft drinks and so on. So maybe there's also room for nutritional interventions here. So the focus would need to shift really much more from a focus on calories and a food self-sufficiency that is not existing and not attainable anyway, to micronutrients and the availability of micronutrients, especially for vulnerable groups like women and children. In the whole food security debate. And the last point, and also big difference, is what Nadim has already pointed out, political risk, right? And again, we are not talking about agriculture or agricultural interventions. Those countries where we really have dramatic food security risks, that's all due to politics in Yemen, in Syria, and so on. So let's not talk about technocratic solutions and silver bullets or whatnot, but really call out those politicians who create and maintain these conflicts. They are responsible for a lot of the food insecurity happening in these countries, and often they have weaponized food supplies for political goals.
Sure. Thank you, Eckhard. Dina, I come back to you. IFAD, what measures is IFAD taking to support the Middle East agriculture? I mean, you are at the center of the storm.
So Ugo, right? I was very much following on the lines of Eckhart, and you took me back to what we're actually trying to do. So IFAD, as you said, is the International Fund for Agriculture Development. It's an international financing institution, so an IFI, but it also has a dual role as a UN specialized agency. It was established in 1978. And to date has, I would say, had over 23 billion of concessional loans and grants to some of the poorest nations in the world, but also in some cases, not only because we have middle income countries as well as part of our clients. So you said, what measures are we taking? This is IFAD's bread and butter. I mean, we work on all parts of the food system, and we design tailor-made solutions that actually fit in the context. So as we were just hearing from Nadim and from Eckhart, the region is very diverse. It's very heterogeneous. So we don't go with one size fits all. We don't have a blueprint. We actually have, we look at tailor-made solutions that support but also mitigate some of the national policies. And I think this goes very well with what Eckhart said. Sometimes national policies are not favorable actually for food security. and are not favorable to all these other challenges that we have seen. So we try to also, through our own interventions, to mitigate some of the impact of these policies. Another is, of course, we invest in environment and climate change adaptation. This is big for us and big for IFAD. Actually, in the case of IFAD, we have the world's largest smallholder adaptation program, which has actually, it started a couple of years ago, but has really picked up because of the challenges of climate, but also identifying the necessity of actually targeting the smallholders, because these are really the communities and the people who are at the center of ensuring the global food security. We also work on developing small and medium enterprises, and this is directly linked to job creation and unemployment. Youth unemployment is a big issue in the MENA region. We have some of the highest numbers. And we also look at linking the smallholders to markets and accessing technologies. We've realized that when we talk about, development has been delivering a lot of financing to this, to addressing most of the challenges and emerging, situations. But we realize that if we don't provide efficient means for dealing with this, and one of them is digitalization. It's not a fad. It is really going to be able to address and to give value for money of what most of the international community is trying to do in this region and globally as well. Of course, infrastructure is equally important. And when I talk infrastructure, it's just not just roads and production infrastructure, but we're also talking about, the ecosystem, making sure the entire ecosystem is functioning. And this is where IFAD really puts a lot of its efforts. One other important area, as I mentioned before, is on the policy front. And we actually look to improve collaboration between not just, the actors that we work with, but also between the private sector, governments, and institutions alike that are working in the space, especially in agriculture sector. So this is what IFAD has been doing. Now, if you ask me what we would like to do, or is basically
yes, I do.
a better.
I asked. Yes.
A better integration, frankly speaking, of many of these issues. Eckhart talked about nutrition and obesity, and I think sustainable diets is going to become really prominent for many countries. Looking at consumption, looking at wastage, looking at post-harvest losses, all these are part of the food system that really we need to tackle as well, because the waste is huge, but also we've seen these bad consumption practices in some of these countries. So what we do in IFAD, but we also encourage international organizations to do is to integrate many of these factors. So I'll give you an example. Nutrition is one, climate change and climate adaptation is another. We look at gender, the role that the gender can play in trying to create also opportunities for women. And then, of course, youth, who are an extremely important element to factor in the MENA region. And what we also do is to tap into specialized funds. So IFAD sees this role here as an assembler of financing, because we cannot alone, neither can the World Bank alone, neither can any of the institutions alone do this. So to tackle these enormous challenges. So we look at ourselves really as playing an assembly role of financing, a brokering role, so we can bring to light many of these issues that are facing these countries, but also that are a threat to food security. And the final point that I wanted to just put there on the table, and maybe we'll have a chance to come back to, is that, we do talk a lot, as even Eckhart was saying, and a lot of these governments, and Nadim also spoke to that. And I think, the international community really has a crucial role to really call out these, these harmful and sometimes, I would say, harmful, but also undermining policies that are taken up by some of these governments. And of course, we need to raise awareness amongst us. We need to raise global awareness. We have the means to do that. So I think we need to really bring light to many of these issues. And finally, to promote regional and international cooperation. It's not just about the MENA region, but it's also, we're working in a globalized world. So I think we need to bring and factor this into our work and our intervention. So I'll stop there, Hugo, and I think you've heard a lot from me.
Oh, it's never enough. Nadim, water scarcity and water demand are both increasing and compelling issues. So what to do?
Yeah, this is the...
you are the man of the water.
Yeah, water is near and dear to my heart. So yeah, this is my passion. But yeah, across the board, across all the MENA countries, we note that there is a very, very, very low cost recovery in all the systems that are at work. So people are not paying appropriate tariffs for the cost recovery, which then reduces the investment in the sector and invites subsidy, which doesn't really support anybody. And at the end of the day, the systems tend to fail because there is no ownership or vested interest in maintaining a system. So cost recovery, to me, is topmost. When people realize that the more they pay, the more they use, the more they pay, then they become more aware and use less water than need be. And that's across all sectors, be that household use or farm use. That is critical. Next to that, and I wouldn't prioritize one over the other. I would just go broadly across. I would want to look into demand management. Most countries in our part of the world are fixated. Now this has changed a little bit on securing new sources of water. This is not the major issue. The major issue is that whatever sources we have may be adequate if managed properly. And for that, to do that, we need to do several things. First and foremost is to reduce the unaccounted for water. The illegal tapping into networks, that's priority. The cutting out of leakages, that's another priority. And then making sure that irrigation practices are appropriate. Appropriate in the sense that the right amount of water is applied in the right place at the right time. So it's not only technology that needs to come in there. What is also needed is proper scheduling of irrigation and making sure that that happens at the right time, in the right place. So we need to overhaul the thinking that's happening there, that it's not if you throw technology at the problem, you solve it. No. In some of the studies that were done at AUB, we noticed that when farmers were provided with trickle systems, which are supposed to be quite efficient in irrigation practices, farmers still used 80% more than what was needed. They didn't know how much they need to apply, and they didn't know when to start and when to stop. So they had this shotgun approach, open it and then, we'll see what happens. Also, what we really need to look at is to see how we can reuse whatever water we're using. And I don't want to call it reuse. I would like to say there is a multiple use of this resource. So if we take water from a fresh source, how many times can we use it before it really becomes needy of treatment, severe treatment, so that it can be reused? So it has to go through, and there are many examples that we can use. We can use fresh water to grow fish, breed fish, and that's a major source of nutrients, of proteins that is relatively cheap and that can address and talk to the issue of poor nutrition that Eckhart mentioned. And then that water can itself be used in irrigation, which then the tailwater of that or the recycled water of that can be used and treated in further uses. We've done that at AUB. We've looked at different reuses, and it has shown that aquaculture, water used in aquaculture, does have quite significant benefits and in reducing the reliance on agrochemicals and producing similar effects to fertilizers. And then also what we need to do is look at improving storage capabilities. Then this brings up the topic of dams, and everybody's going to go up in arms. Dams are the absolute evil. They're not. There may be dams that are poorly designed, poorly conceived, and they should not be there. But dams are a necessity, especially along the Mediterranean area, because as climate is changing, and it has changed quite significantly, snow cover, which feeds groundwater, which many countries rely on, is going away. Pretty soon, mid-century to the end of century, that we won't have enough snow coverage to improve, to recharge our groundwater. Whatever precipitation we'll be getting will be in the form of rainfall. And the distribution, the temporal distribution of this rainfall is fixed in one part of the year. The remaining parts of the year are fairly dry. And we really need to make sure that what falls during the wet season is made available during the dry season. So this is critical here in terms of what to do. And we really need to be aware of this and make sure that water permeates every developmental strategy that we work on. It has to be considered in agricultural development, in urban development. We cannot grow out as we are doing nowadays. Areas are being converted into impervious zones where water, whatever water gets in, is no longer getting into the subsurface. We need to rethink our development. We really need to rethink our also population, the demographics strategy or thinking to reduce all of this and make sure that what we grow relies more on precipitation rather than irrigation, and make sure we grow the right crops and develop native species already there, but we need to improve on our science locally to be able to address this problem again locally. So I'll close with this, maybe then we can talk later about other stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadim. Hey, Kirk, what could be the you mentioned before the weaponization of the food. So what could be the political consequence of climate change and food insecurity in the region? Microphone.
The short answer is, I don't know. It's very difficult. Also, the question is, how is climate change, how much of food insecurity is caused by climate change, right? We tend to subsume under climate change everything, from food insecurity to desertification to overgrazing and so on. Some of these developments have existed without climate change. Climate change aggravates them in some cases. I think what one can say rather safely, Dina has pointed it out, there will be an impact on agriculture. So together with still some population growth over the coming decades, no doubt about it, there will be an increased rise of imports. And as such, the question will be increasingly important: from where do they get the hard currency to pay for food imports, if those food imports are generated elsewhere, right? Like this whole question, what happens to the export powerhouses of the world, that are, by the way, increasingly in new world regions, right? If we take a look at the trade relationships of the MENA region, new suppliers have emerged, a lot of them from the tropical countries. Brazil, for example, is now a major exporter to the MENA. It wasn't that in the 1970s of staple foods, for example. Also, palm oil coming mainly from Malaysia and Indonesia. And Russia has partly substituted North America and other traditional suppliers in the case of grains. So a lot really will depend of this adaptation process will depend on economic policies. For example, how can they create new sources of foreign income? Maybe green hydrogen. There's this green hydrogen plan of the European Union. So there are markets possibly in this area. And obviously the region has considerable advantages in producing green hydrogen, a lot of sun radiation, large empty spaces in some countries. So probably we need to think about food security and climate change adaptation much more in the overall economic sense, not just focusing on food and agriculture, where there is room for a lot of adaptation, as Nadim has pointed out. But again, I want to raise a word of caution, right? There are no technological silver bullets. Take drip irrigation, right? Everybody loves drip irrigation. It's more efficient and so on. In Morocco, drip irrigation has increased water consumption. Why? It's very efficient. It's much more efficient than flood irrigation. But if we use the efficiency gains to increase production and exports, to be among the top 5 exporter of strawberries, you increase your water consumption. If you get a loan from the European Union or from your government to have state-of-the-art irrigation equipment that is run by PV cells, well, then you can run it 24/7 or as long as the sun is shining. The sun doesn't send you a bill like a diesel fueled irrigation pump. And you will have the environmentally friendly depletion of aquifers, right? So there is not really this kind of silver bullet. Nothing against drip irrigation, can be done, should be done, and so on. But I think there is often too much of a focus on these technological silver bullets that do not exist, and we need to think in a much more holistic way.
Thank you. Well, we have time for a third round. I don't have to tell you to be fast and to be short, because you displayed an amazing capability to be business-like and to say what is important to say. So it's as a moderator, it's one of a very unique experience because usually the participants they like to talk a lot. But before to give you again the floor, I remember to the participant that of course they can. We have time, or we will have time also to collect questions. So if you want some question has already arrived. But I mean, if you want to send more questions, we are here. Welcome. Again, Dina, rural communities. We were talking about, of course, technologies, investment, etc. But that's pretty important. The rural community is the basis of everything. How to increase the productivity?
So, this is IFAD's core constituency. So, really at the heart of what we need or do actually.
Yeah, the constituency. If you find someone put in the money.
So exactly, and we actually pride ourselves by saying we go the last mile and we target the poorest of the poor. But just to put this in context, we're talking of about an estimated 80% of the world's poorest, and an equal proportion of the hungriest live in the rural areas. So this is, we're talking billions of people living in the rural areas. And you asked me what role can they play? So the first thing, let me touch upon what Nadim was saying, better management of natural resources. If it's water, if it's soil, if it's protecting the forests, if we have a better strategies where these rural communities can use their natural habitat in a more sustainable way, I think this is, one important role they can play. The second point, I think, is enhancing their own self-sufficiency. Because as you know, if they're food secure, then it's even the better for everyone. So given the numbers that we were talking about. And of course, the last thing that I think is important to put into context here is the contribution to the rural economy at large. So if we invest in their livelihoods, we increase their opportunities and be able for them to increase their incomes, they'll be able then to make choices. They'll be able then to acquire, the better food, better diets. They would have choices. They would be able maybe to also manage the consumption. So I think what we do normally, we invest in value chain development. And therefore, we also, as I said earlier, we give them access to markets, and sometimes maybe it has its downsides, as Eckhart was saying. If we try too much to help them, then they either overuse the natural resources to be able to access high value commodity markets. But in all cases, I think the rural community have an extremely important role to play. And they contribute to the livelihoods of a large part of the population. So let me give you just an example, Egypt. So we talk about the smallholder farmers in Egypt who are accountable for 80% of the agricultural production there. And despite their role, they are amongst the most vulnerable. So what we try to do in Egypt is actually working more in aggregating, in bringing together communities to work together to support one another, so that there are some sort of also spillover effects that happen when you have a group of people who come together for a particular objective. And so you have the water users associations, as Nadim was saying, but then the issue of tariffs, we have been struggling with that. So I think we need to come together with AUB and find a solution for that, because the issue of tariffs has always been a big struggle for most of us, and I think also for many governments, because there is also a political dimension there. And going back to these communities that I was talking about in Egypt, they contribute and they have an important role to play in the implementation of their resources and management of their resources. So if we engage them in contract farming type of solutions, if we engage them, if we link them with the private sector, and we ensure for them better prices for their produce, continuity of market, so there's some sort of also reliability. It's a win-win arrangement, both for the communities themselves, but also for the population at large. And another thing that I wanted also to bring here was the supporting the smallholder producers and the processors as well. It's not just about the producers, but also the processing part, is also to be able to reduce and prevent the deterioration of good productive lands. I think here it's very important that their role, as I said in the very beginning, is about best use of natural resources and being able to govern their ecosystem. And then, of course, as you know, there is a lot of issues about these smallholders or these rural communities. They are at the brunt. They are dealing with the brunt of the climate effects. I mean, they're the ones who least, we've heard this even in COP26, they contribute the least to the deterioration of our atmosphere and contribute to climate change effects, but they are having to deal with the brunt of it. And I think making also these communities resilient enough to sustain that is equally important. I'll stop there, Ugo. You wanted us punchy.
Thank you.
Back to you.
Thank you. Nadim, how to preserve the agriculture and make it more efficient? Of course, money and technologies and money, I believe, but maybe I'm too superficial.
No, I would start differently.
A little bit, yes, I'm superficial. Yes,
yeah, no. Definitely you will need money, you'll need technology, but for us to make best use of this, we need to educate the farmers. We need to make sure that the farmers are up to the level of acquiring knowledge, and implementing new technologies. This is very difficult now for us to implement best management practices or bringing in technologies for use that would support farming, given the low level of education of farming. This is critical. And we need governmental support in terms of outreach, in that extension workers and extension agencies need to be at the cutting edge of science and at the same time able to simplify this knowledge and pass it on to farmers in a practical manner. Now, this is all talk. This is all talk. But we have had some nice examples, at least starting in Lebanon, and I'm sure elsewhere. But I'm most familiar with the Lebanese Agricultural Research Institute's work in several areas. They are able to contact farmers using simple SMS on the phone. I mean, not even smartphone, the dumb phones. They would send out notes to farmers to cover their crops because frost is anticipated, or start pruning now, or watch out for infestations. We have temperature is rising. All of this, they use weather forecasting knowledge to anticipate problems, pest infestations or similar, and then pass it on to farmers. So this is where we can start. We can also need to reach out to farmers to educate them on how to best schedule their irrigation. Some farmers who are really adept at surface flood irrigation can get efficiencies quite high. And there's no need to invest in the new technologies if people cannot afford it. But then eventually we have to reach a point where technology comes in, plays a major role. Smart agriculture is where we are, where we have to be, where remote sensing can play a role in indicating when and how much to irrigate, what areas need to be irrigated. We need to be able to map out our soils to understand what soils are best or most suitable for different crops or different irrigation measures. Where do we place our drainage systems? How to space this? Where to make use of that, of the collected tailwater or drainage water? All of this is part of the development in technology. So remote sensing is there, smart agriculture in terms of what seeds to plant where. All of this is happening everywhere, much less in our part of the world, because farmers are poorly educated. There is no financing for farmers. The issue of land fragmentation and the inability of farmers to use this technology, even if they are capable, on large tracts of land, so that there is, the scale issue factors out, reduces cost, doesn't happen. Cooperatives are highly politicized if they're allowed to be, and they are fought in another sense because they appear to be a front for political adversarial movements towards governments, perceived. So cooperatives sometimes, most often, don't do their job properly to ward or to overcome land fragmentation issues, investment issues, etc. So on the level of cooperatives, it's imperative that these cooperatives become apolitical. They're decoupled from the political system, and they work to support farmers and to educate them in support or with the support of governmental outreach. So it is, I totally agree with what Eckert has been saying. There is no magical or technological silver bullet. It's not there. It's several things that need to be done: education, support, financial support, small loans for farmers, maybe even grants, working of cooperatives together, and better monitoring and early warning systems in terms of droughts and floods occurring. And also, very critically so, pest infestations. Last year and the year before, we had locust coming up from the Horn of Africa all the way. It reached Lebanon, barely, but farmers were already alerted of this, and they were trying to take precautions. So all of these have to occur at the same time. Thank you.
Thank you. Eckhard, what step could be taken to guarantee resilience of the supply chain and at the same time to keep under control prices volatility?
Yeah, I mean, it's partly out of, or not only partly, mostly out of the hands of the MENA countries, right? The production and a lot of the processing happens outside of the borders of the MENA region. Having said that, and as I've focused on import dependence before and how to manage that vulnerability, there are, for example, 3 measures that could be taken. One is to have some sort of storage, emergency stocks, right? But there's a risk involved as well, because if everybody starts to increase storage like crazy hamsters, you will cause the very thing you try to avoid, yeah, illiquid food markets with rising prices. So there needs to be some sort of international or trans-regional coordination. There might be also the possibility that IFPRI has once suggested of virtual stocks, where you kind of lock in certain amounts at a certain price with the help of derivatives. Then sourcing and market intelligence certainly plays a role. We have seen that in the United Arab Emirates, where they had kind of a task force that was looking during the COVID crisis, okay, if now there's one supplier who's late or who's not able to deliver, to source it from somewhere else. Of course, the Emirates have more possibilities here in that field. They have the money, they have the infrastructure, the bureaucracy, and finally, participation in international initiatives, right? Sometimes there's a trend in the Gulf countries to approach food producers bilaterally to kind of secure privileged bilateral access to food production outside of market mechanisms. But maybe the more important or smarter way to go about that is to participate in multilateral initiatives to make food markets globally more transparent and more efficient. For example, at the WTO, it has mainly focused on import restrictions in the past, and export restrictions actually are not sanctioned under the WTO. So maybe there's a case to be made for food importers to kind of cooperate and form an interest group at the WTO. It happened before during the Uruguay round of the GATT, where net food importing countries of the developing world were lobbying for affordable food imports. Also, the AMIS, the Market Intelligence Initiative after the global food crisis, would come to mind. So these are the 3 things they could take into consideration. Carefully managed stocks, but not in an exaggerated way. Sourcing and market intelligence, and cooperation, multilateral initiatives and cooperation at the international level.
Okay, thank you. So the questions we have received. Wadi Hamza asked, how is the climate change impacting biodiversity in the MENA regions? Helen Lackner, given the various climate change, water and other constraints, what policies do you suggest could improve local food security and staples in the MENA region? And particularly, what can be done to improve incomes and food security for the poorer small holders? And again, Musi Amar, the MENA region is highly dependent on wet imports from Russia and Ukraine. Well, how might a war in Ukraine impact food supply chains in the Middle East? Then I think another question, but I don't have the name, but this is, we have many questions, but I have to stop. In many countries of the MENA region, the population is dependent on public subsidies for foodstuff. What can be done to reduce the financial impact of these subsidies? I start here. I have, as I said, a lot of questions. I also received but the pictures of my first grandson. But this is something who is going to burn next June. But it's another story. It's my personal, it's my private story. So you are free to to answer whatever you want. But I will start with Eka this time. Please, Eka, whatever you want about among all these questions.
Well, maybe I take the Ukraine question. Yeah, very important, and not just wheat, right? Especially barley. Ukraine is a very important supplier, and Saudi Arabia is one of the largest importer in the world for its subsidized raising of livestock, especially of lamb in the country. So, I mean, so far so good. We haven't seen also a massive decrease so far, but yes, it could happen. Yeah, we have seen also in the past, Russia was not necessarily a reliable supplier of wheat, right? They have at times curtailed exports. Having said that, the wheat market is pretty liquid globally, so I wouldn't be too pessimistic that the supplies could be sourced from elsewhere as well. And mind you, there is of course an interest, well, at least on the Russian side, to export and to get the hard currency. So as long as they have sufficient the production in Russia, I don't see them curtailing exports. Ukraine, there could be an interest of Russia to curtail their exports, or they might be curtailed by the political and military developments going ahead. But having said that, the wheat market is really a pretty liquid market. But the barley market is much smaller, right? Especially on the production and on the consumption side. So that is maybe a development to be watched.
Thank you.
Maybe one last word.
Please.
Maybe one last word. The Baltic Freight Index actually so far that has come down, right? So that is indicative that these kind of bottlenecks in supply chains that we have seen as a result of the COVID crisis might abate. So that's maybe some positive news in that regard.
Thank you. Nadim, be free.
Okay, I'll touch upon two things quickly. The subsidy issue is really something that irks me. And especially when comparing that within the WTO. People here look at subsidy as, it is overt in most parts of the Middle East. We pay, the government pays a share of import of flour or of other food, staple foods. And then that becomes an issue when governments are unable to pay, and we get things, this might trigger things like we've seen in Tunisia, like we've seen in Egypt over several years, etc. So this is something that needs to be addressed. But at the same time, there needs to be an equity and fairness in the exporters. France, Britain, Europe, the US, they heavily subsidize agriculture, and nobody's calling them on that. And it's being forced upon us. So we cannot locally compete with whatever is being brought from Europe and from the US. So this is where local support gets lost. How do we improve local food security? This is an issue that is really important so that we can help regional, at least, complementarity in food production happen. So there has to be a balance there. This is really critical for us, and it should be addressed. In many instances, the world now is operating in the might is right approach. Whomever is strongest gets whatever they want right away. But then there has to be fairness and equity in dealing with issues at all levels, in all sectors. Having said that, let me move back to biodiversity. A lot of the forest fires that we have suffered from, let me say two things. Biodiversity is being impacted through forest fires that are affecting the Mediterranean rim tremendously. And we are losing large tracts of forests. And when we lose forest, we're losing vegetative cover, we're losing, exposing our soil to erosion, and that's gone. And we are not able to regenerate forests or regenerate regions for a long time. most of the fires that are started in the Mediterranean area are due to human neglect or arson, the predominant amount. Irrespective of that, climate change is leading to drier conditions, drier underbrush, drier soil, etc. So there needs to, this is one impact, and habitats, great habitats are being lost. Another aspect is the great infestation of insects. The longer the season of growth for insects that's happening, the longer they have opportunity of attacking trees. For example, at AUB, we discovered a pest that attacks the cedar trees, the Cephalsia tanurinensis. It was done here by Dr. Nasr Qawar and Dr. Nabil Nimr. And this is a pest that affects all cedar trees in the region, all trees. And the part of the cycle of this pest is in the soil, and it grew to become a pest and an uncontrolled pest because it is the cold spell has shortened, and they were able to survive winter in greater numbers. So the rising number of pests is killing off a lot of our native and indigenous trees, and this is affecting biodiversity. Then the big elephant in the room also is not only climate change, it's population growth and uncontrolled urban sprawl, but that's, urban growth is eating into forests. And that forest, or sometimes when it pushes into agricultural land, pushes agricultural land into forests. And this is really enhancing monoculture, which is agriculture, and reducing the diversity that is very rich in this part of the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Dina, conclusion.
Well, it's not always easy to come at the very end when a lot has been said. So let me quickly touch upon then the policies and how those can also help to increase the incomes and achieve food security. So the first thing, as many of us have been saying, it's important really to ensure, equitable education. Education is going to be key. And I think that education, when we say, is about educating the communities, but also ensuring evidence-based policy. So bringing awareness of solutions, bringing awareness of to governments and to policymakers about the sort of sustainable agriculture practices, demonstrating where there are very let's say effective ways of ensuring food security in the country. And this is all done through what we call normally in our jargon, the pilots, right? So we try to pilot effective solutions that we can then bring up to policymakers and use that engagement really to change the mindset and to also address sometimes some of those policies that could not be, let's say, conducive for food security. And I think Nadeem was also saying that it's really also important. This subsidy issue is that's a big one. I mean, it's a double-edged sword. It could have its positive also, and we see it. If we take in Europe, for example, I mean, we shouldn't just ignore the fact that there are huge subsidies there, and we can't compare that with the MENA region and what some of these farmers don't even see a trickle of what the farmers in Europe, I would say, receive. So for me, in terms of policies, I think it's really engaging policymakers, keep making them aware of the evidence that exists, so this link with science as well. The other point is about ensuring the prioritization, for example, of sort of community-led organizations. I think this is an important one also to bring to the table. Community-led organizations will actually support communities to give them the power that they need and the voice that they need, but at the same time, it would also give them also room to come together, to have economies of scale, to be able to also achieve, what we call is the value chain, the value chain critical mass that you need actually to be able then to demand higher prices and to be able also to increase their incomes in turn. So for me, I know time has run out. It's been an extremely interesting discussion, hearing all the colleagues, and I think we need more than 1 hour for this. So back to you.
Thank you, Dina. Well, yes, I'm sorry with all the participants because we cannot answer a lot of questions. And I have to say, I didn't know that the echographies today are so clear. So, but anyway, Dina Saleh, Nadim Farajalla, and Eckhard Furz, I really thank you very much because we have had, because of you, thanks of you, a very rich discussion. And thank you also for the many participants, and I hope to see you soon, inshallah. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.